I'm Eva Reifert. I'm the curator for 19th century and modern art at Kunstmuseum Basel. Once you work here as a curator, you soon realize that there are household names in this museum that everybody knows and everybody maybe loves or hates. In this case, it's a tricky question because Arnold Böcklin, who belongs to these patron saints of the Kunstmuseum Basel, he was even during his lifetime a really controversial figure. And going through the literature, you realize that nothing much has changed about that. There are either those who love his work or those who hate it, or who just don't understand it and don't want to bother. So what we are doing here in this installation of Böcklin begegnet, or encountering Böcklin, is we are trying to see for ourselves which aspects of his, for example, were innovative, or completely controversial, or maybe unconventional during his lifetime, or looking back in the sense that people thought that he was like a reactionary figure. So what we decided to do is basically juxtapose one of his work from our collection, which is the most important in the world, by Arnold Böcklin, and then put something else from our collection right next to it. So we basically get, well, constellations you could call them, or dialogues. And this whole installation works in chapters. And here we start with an introduction by Arnold Böcklin himself, who, as you will see, was a master of his own image. He presents himself in this self-portrait from the early 90s in the 19th century, so painted in 1893. He presents himself in the surroundings of his studio. So you see his figure, which is really clad in the latest fashion, you could say. The checkered pants, the jacket that is lined with silver. And he holds the insignia of his art, the brush in the right hand and the palette in the left hand. And of course, his gaze is not directed at the viewer, but it's kind of like far off, and very self-confident in his assurance. And if you turn to this work, you'll see that this is an external view of the same man. And it's somewhat more subdued, maybe. It's maybe also more accurate because it shows the deep lines in his face. And this was sculpted, this bronze portrait was done by Adolf von Hildebrand, who was an acquaintance of Böcklin's, who lived in Berlin. And there, the museum commissioned this work by Arnold Böcklin, which again tells you that by this time in the late 19th century, he was already so famous that the Berlin people wanted a portrait by the famous Basel painter, right? So here you see that the right side is drooping, and that's about the only hint you get that he had suffered a stroke shortly before, which is something that you wouldn't guess looking at this work. And by way of introduction, that already tells us that there are always more sides than one and more image than one to us. And if you're acquainted with the process of doing self-portraits and selfies all the time, you'll know how true that is. There are always many facets to one person, and what we are trying to accomplish here in this installation is showing the many facets of Böcklin's art. This constellation we entitled Revisiting Ancient Myths. And this goes to show how different the outcome can be, even if you're painting the same thing. Jean-François de Troyes, in the 18th century, painted this Rococo-esque scene of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and there the tale from the goddess Diana, who transformed a young huntsman into a deer because he had to be punished for stealing a glance at the bathing goddess. And his punishment is severe and in the end fatal because his dogs don't realize that their master had been transformed, and they just kill him. Jean-François de Troyes basically uses this subject from this ancient tale by Ovid as a pretext for giving us this luxurious and wonderful display of all these naked and half-naked women and the luxurious drapery and the beautiful colors. So you could probably say this is a rather, at his time, conventional treatment of this subject. When you then compare what Böcklin did to the same tale, but 130 years later, you'll see why his contemporaries found it rather difficult to kind of agree with his modern take on these events. So here you'll see that, again, the stag has been marginalized. It's right at the margin at the right-hand side. It's a slightly later scene, so where he chases off there, here the deer is already being killed by his own dogs. And then you have these three small figures that are outscaled just by nature, by this panoramic thicket. And that was something that for the contemporaries, it was really not easy to reconcile what their attention was towards these ancient myths and to the way Böcklin treated this in this first major work from the 1860s. So comparing these two works, you really see how if you treat the same subject, even though it's slightly later slightly different scenes, how you can treat it in this sort of like lavish display of almost naked bodies, or you can turn it into something that's more a meditation on nature maybe, or something where the actual figures do not fulfill the attention basically of a lifetime of a contemporary viewer, expecting more of that than just this display of a panoramic thicket with dwarfed figures from mythology. This is the second instance where we want to revisit ancient myths and how Böcklin deals with them in his painting. So to juxtapose two works again, we start here with a contemporary of his, Frank Buchser, also a Swiss painter. This work was in storage for ages. It didn't even have a frame, so we had one made. And this work shows us the story of Odysseus and Calypso. Calypso is a nymph living on a remote island. And Odysseus, who you know from Homer's Odyssey, he comes to be stranded on this island. And the nymph tries to keep him there because, of course, she falls in love with him. She tries to entice him to stay with the promise of immortality and gets, as you can see, quite desperate when he still yearns for his wife Penelope and wants to leave her. She keeps him there for 7 years, and then Zeus intervenes and she has to let Odysseus go. Anyway, we are now asking ourselves, how does Frank Buchser deal with this story? And you can see this is a really, really exaggerated pose where Calypso basically tries to grab and hold on to Odysseus, and he shows his longing for his wife with this exaggerated gesture. Like, you can't miss any of that because it's really, really obvious. And to drive home the point, in case anybody hadn't noticed that, like what's going on here, Frank Buchser personifies the lost love by showing us Cupid as a secondary figure, as an assistant figure. So Cupid turns away saddened by seeing how this love is unrequited and how these two people won't come together. What is remarkable, though, about the painting is the sort of color-filled texture that Frank Buchser gives to the scene. You won't look for innovation in Frank Buchser's treatment of the figurative aspect of the story. But when you consider the right-hand side here and the sort of color-filled painting that you see there, this is way ahead of its time, and almost it maybe makes you think of abstract expressionist painting from the 1940s and 50s. So the sort of dissolution of the subject matter into just animated brushstrokes, something that expresses the dramatic aspect of this love lost or unrequited, you should say. Turning now to the work by Arnold Böcklin, you'll see that he chooses an entirely different approach. And let me remind you, it's just 10 years between these two paintings. What you see here is, again, Calypso, and she's basically bedded on this wonderful red cloak. It's a flaming red, signifying her passion. And then you see the blue figure of Odysseus staring into the distance. There is nothing at all between them except this sort of emotional gap. So he doesn't need an assistant figure. He doesn't need a third, like something of an allegory to personify what's happening here. This is just, it's more like a psychological understanding of the dynamics between man and woman. And this is also what makes it so stark and in a way unforgiving, because you see this rocky landscape here. This is not a pleasure island or something. This signifies really the rocky relationship or the emotional coldness. Again, looking at how Böcklin treats the same subject matter, you can imagine that contemporaries may have expected something more Buxer-like from the story of unrequited love. But what Böcklin does is give it this psychological undercurrent, make it stark and austere, and still transport a depth of meaning that's truly astonishing. So by juxtaposing this austere figure of Odysseus and the longing Calypso here, and then just emphasizing the emotional distance between them. Just the center of the picture really is just distance and void. Among the many interesting aspects of Böcklin's life is how deeply he was rooted in the Basel art scene. He was close friends with the famous art historian Jakob Burkhart. Jakob Burkhart himself had actually basically invented the subject of art history and became a famous art critic and art historian of the Renaissance. Jakob Burkhart made the mistake to criticize Arnold Böcklin prior to the execution of frescoes for the old museum at Augustinergasse. And Böcklin was clearly not prepared to take the criticism. So he ended the friendship, and in the year later, he actually executed these, like several humoristic mascarons for the garden facade here at the Kunsthalle in Basel. And people familiar with the art scene recognized a strange resemblance in these rather irreverent, satirical faces, as in this instance, and the famous art historian Jakob Burkhart. So maybe that was Böcklin's way to get back at the famous art historian. When you now look at this portrait, this very conventional portrait of Jakob Burkhart executed by Arthur Volkmann, you'll see that this is also, although it's completely serious, not without a humoristic effect, although unintended, of course. Because the way he shows this man clad in an ancient, like toga-style cloak, and this receding head, almost like Caesar or something, this gives it also like an undercurrent of irony, but again, not intentional. What's nice in this juxtaposition of works from our collection is that here you see this totally stiff but also totally appropriate portrait executed by Arthur Volkmann of the famous art historian Jakob Burkhart. And then next to it you see this intentionally humorous, satirical it's not exactly a portrait, but take on Jakob Burkhart's personality by Böcklin. And then you get this background of these two quarreling, and you can imagine a time where they were center figures in the Basel art life, and you just wish you could have been part of that and see them in action, like these two grand figures of late 19th century artistic life in this city. Literature and art have long enjoyed the closest relationship. This dates back even to antiquity. If you think back to the constellations where we saw two artists drawing from Ovid or from Homer, you'll see that this was already part of a well-established culture, that painters drew from literary sources. In the 19th century, though, this basically received something like a boost, or there was a real innovative quality in drawing from more modern literary sources. For example, Shakespeare's plays, which had become disseminated throughout the German-speaking lands in the 18th century. Joseph Anton Koch was an Austrian painter who was based in Rome, and there he had gathered an entire circle of artists from the German-speaking lands around him, and they all were interested in the Italian Renaissance as their main source of inspiration. For example, here you can see how Joseph Anton Koch paints this important scene where Macbeth and his friend Banquo encounter the three weird sisters. So these witches who basically give them the self-fulfilling prophecy. And in how he depicts them, you can see the heavy influence of Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel. In a very romantic fashion, and typical for the Romantic era, you see that the entire background basically is devoted to enhance what's happening in the foreground. So nature basically reflects the emotional content of the work. So this is a tempestuous work because it's a tempestuous moment. And the same thing happens with Böcklin when he paints the life of the great Renaissance poet Petrarch. Now you'll say, well, that's not literature. But of course it is, because Petrarch himself wrote down his life, and by doing that, his life became the stuff of legend. And painting Petrarch here, Böcklin shows the famous poet at the source of his inspiration, and in quite a literal sense, because this is the Fontaine de Vaucluse in Provence in France, where the poet sings to his beloved Laura, who inspired him for his great love poetry. Basically, all sorts of love poetry that you today take as a given has its source in this famous sonnet that Petrarch wrote about Laura at the Fontaine de Vaucluse. And similar to what Joseph Anton Koch did here, but of course in an entirely different emotional setting, you see how, again, nature basically reflects the mood of the work. So this is something that's cave-like, that's well protected, where nature gives shelter to the human spirit and the inspiration of the poet. Arnold Böcklin for a while was part of this aforementioned German-Roman circle gathered around the Austrian painter Joseph Anton Koch in Rome. And there he met Anselm Feuerbach and Hans von Marais. And here we are comparing these three works by Böcklin, by Hans von Marais, and in this instance Anselm Feuerbach, because they, at one point or another, painted young children in their works. Here you see that Anselm Feuerbach chooses this very austere approach, and his antiquicizing figure of the mother looking down at her child is filled with tenderness, but also there is the severe quality. And she almost looks like an ancient goddess, although it is supposedly a scene taken from real life somewhere at the border of Antiquity. The relationship here is one of closeness, as indicated by the downward gaze, but also of distance. And as you can see, the sky basically is the backdrop, and our gaze has to travel upwards to really see the entire figure in this surprisingly large format. So, juxtaposing this work that is, you could say, antique in spirit, we chose Hans von Marais' work, which is almost completely sketchy. Hans von Marais here also paints a young child, and he even gives a title, just the child. So this is what it's really about, this whole work. And the child is surrounded by towering figures by comparison. So these clad in antique togas, and then two horses, and the child itself sits on the ground, rather attentive, its gaze directed toward the viewer in a rather adult posture. And the most interesting aspect of this whole work is not just how the child is painted, but also the entire surface, that you can see the individual brush strokes, that it's very sketch-like in character, which is again very, you could almost say somber in mood, very dark, subdued colors, similar to the ones that Anselm Feuerbach also used. And then you get this third way of painting children in the span of about 10 to 20 years, where Arnold Böcklin has decisively entered his symbolist phase. And he gives us the image of the young child as the beginning of life. In his whole composition, he basically draws from a subject, an allegorical subject, called the staircase of life, that had been around for a while in art history. And usually you would expect to find a proper staircase, and then people positioned there according to their age. First they ascend the case and then the staircase, and then they descend. And at the end, of course, they die. So you gather strength and then you lose it and then you're dead. So that's basically the idea of this subject. And Böcklin turns it into, well, it has an idiosyncratic twist. Starting with the children here, then moving on to basically man and woman in their prime, and it ends on top in this case. So we follow the gaze upward. That's the itinerary of life, starting from young age to death, and there, as a symbol of death, you see the skeleton about to strike out at an old seated man. The colors here are vivid, they are intense, and one of the most maybe beautiful aspects of this whole work is this small rivulet of a river and the single floating flower here. We've now seen that Böcklin has a rather naturalistic face, something where he's close to almost a realistic take on nature, for example. We've seen that he's moved on to a romantic understanding of landscape as a backdrop, as something that enhances the atmosphere of his work. And we've then moved on to the symbolist Böcklin. And here we are again, Böcklin painting symbolist specters. And as I said, Böcklin became one of the key figures really of the symbolist movement throughout Europe. This is one of the last, if not the last, painting that Arnold Böcklin executed. It's called The Plague, and it shows the figure of death astride on an ugly dragon, sweeping through a town, the narrow streets of a city. And the dragon is shown with these bat-like dark wings and this ugly neck that ends in this beak-like head, and it breathes miasma, something like deadly steam. So when you realize that this work was painted at a time where it was not yet established what actually killed people when they were hit by the plague, or when they were hit by cholera or typhus, you maybe get a sense of the horror that must have permeated the streets, because people did not know what killed them. Today, at least, in most instances, we know the sort of transmission, the ways of transmission, and we know what we are up against. But if you imagine that India at the time when Böcklin painted this was ravaged by the plague, and people did not yet fully understand what actually caused the illness, and they were dropping dead left and right, that must have been an entirely other level of horrific helplessness to experience. And I think it's interesting how this work during the Corona crisis became so prominently displayed in places like newspapers and magazines, because you can see that art can be painted at one point in time and mean something, and then decades later, maybe centuries later, in a different sociological context, gain an entirely new meaning and maybe even more pertinence. Speaking of symbolist specters and giving form and shape and actually personifying something that you can see and understand, That's something that also happens here in this work by Albert Welti, who was the young disciple, or the young apprentice, I should say, of Böcklin's. He painted with Böcklin in his Zurich studio, and then desperately tried to detach himself from the master. He even moved to Munich to find his own footing, and then still in that phase you see there are strong similarities. He had not yet gained his own style, but he's strongly influenced still by his master. And what he's painting here are riders in the mist. Basically, he observes a mountaintop and sees the swirling fog around it, and then it's this sort of idea that what you see as a natural phenomenon has to have a different cause, something that you can attribute to this natural phenomenon you actually see. So in this case, they are riders who dance or chase around the mountaintop. And this is how he paints it. He basically inscribes these riders into the fog. They are barely discernible, but then again you see their figures and you realize this is what the fog looks like when it's swirling. So the symbolist specters we see here are the plague, and the plague, of course, is a stand-in for all sorts of dangerous illnesses that Böcklin himself was intimately acquainted with, because his life and the life of his family had frequently been threatened by illnesses like the cholera and typhus. And in this instance, you again see this idea that you give shape to something that's maybe a natural phenomenon. So you see the riders chasing around a mountaintop and personifying, giving shape to the swirling fog. Böcklin's fame as a symbolist painter in the late 19th century is almost entirely based on his creation of this work, The Island of the Dead. Böcklin created several versions of this subject, but this is the first and most important one. We are not entirely sure what happens here, and that's part of the mystique surrounding this painting. We see an island. We see the Black Sea surrounding it and removing it from our realm of experience. And we see these vertical trees rearing up against the black sky, so these cypress-like Mediterranean trees. And there is a figure cloaked in white and a shrouded coffin, and both move on a bark towards this island, which makes us guess that probably this is the burial ground. But we don't really know the context. It's just that all these signs that we are given evoke something for us, and we get a feeling for the atmosphere, the solemnity of the scene. Which is why we use this work to compare it with Max Ernst's version of The Great Forest. And you get a feeling that Max Ernst, who worked decades later, is one of the most important surrealist painters, that he really took Böcklin's Island of the Dead and wanted to reinterpret the theme. But of course it's also his own creation and something entirely different. But you also get the horizontal orientation, the vertical orientation of these trees, of the great forest. You get the entirely black backdrop of the sky, and to add to the mystique of the atmosphere, again, light in a strange ring-shaped form of a celestial body, which tells us it can't be part of our realistic experience of the world, but of something surreal, because we just don't know of a star that looks like that. Both painters here work with elements in the painting that create an emotional resonance in the beholder. And that is something that to give shape to our feelings and to create something where our feelings can attach themselves to and relive something that the painter presents us with. That's basically the essence of symbolism. Of all the facets of Böcklin that we have introduced so far, this one is a thematic one. The theme of horse and rider is something that dates back to antiquity. It's something that is present throughout art history. The strong union of beast and man. If you think back to equestrian statues, for example, that it's a unity and they both enhance each other's force. So on the left-hand side, in this case, you see Böcklin's fight on the bridge. You see a barbarian force charging into the picture from the left-hand side to the middle, and then they overwhelm civilized forces that are also properly dressed in armor to the right. And the barbarians, of course, themselves, they are naked and they are wild and unleashed. The bridge itself is barely holding, and below the bridge in a muddy stream, you see people struggling for their lives and trying to rescue themselves to the other border. Of course, a painting like this can't happen with blue sky in the background, so the backdrop, the sky is appropriately dark and tempestuous. Edgar Degas was active in the Impressionist circle in Paris, and here he paints a fallen jockey. And in fact, this work is the outcome of a 30-year-long struggle, of a process that took him 3 decades to paint this subject of a man where the unity between horse and man is severed, is sundered. So this gains almost a symbolical meaning of modern man and modern times, because the prefiguration of this theme of someone who fell off the horse is maybe the road to Damascus, the biblical story of Saul who fell from his horse when he saw the vision of God. And he was converted, he was granted a new beginning, a new chance to redeem himself. But in this case, you feel that this won't be the case with this fallen jockey. So there is no way we can regain the unity of horse and rider. We've already heard that sometimes contemporaries complained about Böcklin's rather modern take and unusual view of the ancient subjects. For example, here he uses a satirical take on our approach to show these nymphs playing in the surf of the water. You have nymphs somersaulting and whooping with joy, observing their peers, and here you have a baby with a fish tail, and in general they are boisterous and they are very loud and noisy. They are not at all restrained goddesses as they are supposed to be. You even get the voyeuristic gaze here and there, so there are men present and they're ogling the nymphs, but this is subverted by Böcklin's way of depicting the women and them just having fun. So this sense of subversion is something that is really notable here. This does not at all speak to the sort of voyeuristic impulses of the viewer, but rather brings a smile to our face. Another way of subversion with this old theme of bathing women is seen here where Félix Vallotton paints his baigneuses that were shown in the Salon des Indépendants in 1906 in Paris. He takes the opposite approach to subvert our expectations with this theme of bathing women. Félix Vallotton shows us slate gray water, divides the picture in these two spaces of light and water, and then he shows us these figures, these bathing women, gently playing in the water, but almost statuesque. Their bodies are not at all idealized. They almost look like stone sculptures, and everything seems to be frozen in time. In fact, you may get the impression that they're bathed rather in light than in water. 8 years after Arnold Böcklin had painted his initial version of the Island of the Dead, he followed with the Island of Life, which you see here. And in this vision of life, you see dancing people here in the middle ground. You have a procession of sorts in the foreground of a faun and a nymph, and basically there are swans everywhere. The atmosphere is that of a bright summer's day with rather friendly clouds, blue skies, and a Mediterranean flora. The comparison here is with Walter Kurt Wiemken. Walter Kurt Wiemken was a Basel-based painter, and he, like so many of his peers, was confronted with a problem of finding a way to relate to their famous predecessor, Arnold Böcklin. How would you do that? Like with a figure that towering in the city's history, you have to find a way, either you take his influences for granted and you develop them, or you would just try to basically find your own way without ever referencing his art. Walter Kurt Wiemken chose the former, and he in fact probably directly relates to this work, The Island of Life, maybe even in the color scheme of this work that he painted in 1935. Walter Kurt Wiemken calls this work life, and what he shows us is not very reassuring. In the center of it all, he shows us the Sphinx as a very mercurial image, and at the heart of his vision of life is death. And this is just a fascinating reference to Böcklin, because he shows the island of the dead. It's like a quote that he inserts into his own picture. So basically what he's saying is, at the heart of life is death and destruction. And this is also how he references this group of dancing figures, probably a direct reference to the Island of Life by Böcklin, including a graveyard with a tombstone and a cannon. So this is a dark vision of life, which makes sense when you look at the date of creation, because it was done in 1935, and everybody at the time knew that war was coming. So Walter Kurt Wiemken suffered from this anxiety of impending war and gave it, found a way to depict his anxieties in this dark vision of what life actually means, including, and that is chilling even nowadays, I guess, these elements that probably signify something like nationalist tendencies, with these flags put up on a scaffolding that looks helter-skelter-like, and the globe that is positioned on the verge of downfall. It may be unexpected to think of Cy Twombly, the great abstract expressionist painter, and Arnold Böcklin, the great symbolist painter, as kindred spirits, but here we are. Both, in fact, shared their great love for mythology and for references to antique stories, and both also used them in non-narrative ways. So what do we mean by that? In fact, both in their oeuvre referenced stories from Homer or from Ovid in very concrete ways, as we've seen with Böcklin with his depiction of Odysseus and Calypso. But Böcklin also was revered for his ability to distill antiquity into these landscapes of the spiritual. And the most important work of that kind was the Sacred Grove, which you see here. The Sacred Grove actually operates similar to the Island of the Dead. There are signs that are given to us as the beholder, and we have to make sense of them, and these pictorial signs, they evoke an atmosphere and subsequently a feeling in the beholder. So here, for example, you have in the center a sacrificial fire. You have a procession of figures, priestly figures clad in white. Again, you have a liminal space because you have to traverse a distance to get to the sacrificial fire. This is marshland. You even see the reflection here. So this is muddy, and you have to traverse this pavement to get there. And it's a remote area of a temple district. The temple, in fact, is seen here through the trees. There is a figure, like a huge statue probably, that is illuminated by the afternoon sun. But the atmosphere of this grove is shadowy and withdrawn and solemn and very, very quiet. So by following these signs in the picture with your eyes, you start to make sense of the atmosphere, and there is the solemnity, the quiet spiritual aspect that basically is reflected in how you perceive the work. And it's really not that different to what Saint-Twombly does. So where Böcklin gives us these signs and hints that are figurative, these figures, the priestly figures and the procession and the grove and the shadowy atmosphere and the sacrificial fire, Saint-Twombly here in 1959, in this abstract time of expression, he uses numerical sequences, hints to ancient Greek culture by referencing the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, the Aegean island Delos, or even rows of numbers that evoke the sort of realm of mathematics. So everything tends towards the spiritual, even the white surface of this nondescript painting. And then you get these scribbles, and even they, although they are not in a strict sense writing, reference the act of writing. At the outset, our intent was to get to know Böcklin better, and to, after realizing that there are so many facets to his oeuvre, we thought that it was just reasonable to juxtapose his work with that of his contemporary and predecessors and like-minded artists later on. And it gave us immense pleasure, and I hope I was able to convey that in this tour, to get to know him better, to encounter him, but also to see these encounters of his with other painters and sculptors. So I guess what we really wanted to do was give this sort of panoramic view, but at the same time find the elements, unexpected elements that click together and give a better sense of his personality, the pitfalls, the idiosyncratic aspects maybe, unconventional treatment of ancient myths, but also color that the contemporaries thought were garish and loud, subversive aspects, and so on. I guess I hope that this installation just accomplishes to give a broader picture of someone who was all too often shown as a monodimensional figure in art history in the late 19th century.